We're moving in a new direction, moving forward, and moving beyond smoking. We are Altria, and our companies are leading the way in moving adult smokers away from cigarettes by taking action to transition millions toward potentially less harmful choices as we move from being known as a tobacco company to being recognized as a tobacco harm reduction company. Altria is moving beyond smoking. Find out how at altria.com.
Holidays are here, and so is fashionable fitness. Gift yourself a Samsung Galaxy Z Flip 3 5G, a phone that folds in half to literally stand on its own. Pair it with the Galaxy Watch 4 for ultimate wellness and wow factor. Check health stats, flex personal records. Over 90 activities can be tracked, like biking, swimming, golfing, and more. Invest in yourself with tech made to crush goals. Holidays open up with Galaxy. Shop it all at Samsung.com. 5G connection and availability may vary. Check with carrier. Products sold separately.
Hey everyone, this is the Almost World Podcast. Bringing to you mind-blowing interviews with guests from all over the world. So settle down, relax, and enjoy the show. Oh yeah, by the way, if you like the podcast, please support Elmo's World Podcast on Patreon. Your support is what helps the podcast improve more and more. 3. Welcome to Elmo's World Podcast. This is Elmo Dor Jr., your host, and I am with my friend Ian Olasov. Hey bro, can you tell us something about yourself?
Sure. Hey, how's it going? Thank you so much for inviting me to do this. I really appreciate it. So, let's see. I live in Brooklyn, New York. I teach philosophy at Brooklyn College, and I think you probably found out about me because of a book I wrote, which came out a couple of months ago, called Ask a Philosopher. So maybe I'll just say a little bit about the book, and that'll give people a sense of why they may or may not be interested in listening to me talk. So I do a lot of public philosophy. I do a lot of philosophy with people outside of universities. And one of the things that I do through this organization, Brooklyn Public Philosophers, which I've run for the last few years, is this thing called the Ask a Philosopher booth. So we started in the spring of 2016, where some local philosophy professors and grad students and I will take a booth and a little banner that says Ask a Philosopher, and just sort of set up shop somewhere in the city. So we've set up at farmers markets and Pride Parade and street fairs and subway stations and so on. And we sit and we wait for people to talk to us. We set out a little bowl full of philosophical questions printed out on pieces of paper. Questions like, what's happiness, or should there be prisons?
Awesome.
Or is it possible for there to be a scientific study of consciousness? And a bowl of thought experiments. So, for example, if you had no sensory experiences whatsoever, if you couldn't see anything or feel anything or hear anything and so on, would you be aware of yourself? Classic thought experiment from the philosopher Ibn Sina, and a bowl of candy. And so, this book, the Ask a Philosopher the Ask a Philosopher book, sort of came out of this project. It collects what I think are some of the best questions that we've gotten at the booth, and my attempts to answer them, and a bunch of sort of little vignettes or stories from the booths that sort of make them sticky, that make them memorable, that were sort of funny or affecting or interesting in one way or another. And I think the goal, at least in writing the book, was to give people a sense of sort of what the vibe was like at the booth itself, but also to give people something that they could get into, that they could read if maybe they already have some background in philosophy, they've been thinking about philosophy or studying philosophy for a long time. Maybe they have no background at all, but something that could be sort of relatively painless, but still interesting and substantive, and not just I don't know, not just fluff. So in any case, that was the kind of goal of the book. So hopefully it succeeded. But
yeah.
Anyway, I could say all sorts of things about myself, but maybe that's what'll be most of interest to whoever's listening.
Can you talk about what the basics of your beliefs, right? Or what fundamentals, like God isn't real, or this and that? What do you believe?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I like to think that there's a sense in which none of my beliefs are basic. There's a sense in which if a basic belief is a belief that is completely immune to revision in light of new evidence, then none of my beliefs are basic in that sense.
Yeah.
But beliefs that are basic in the sense of being about, I don't know, how the sort of fundamental structure of the world, or the beliefs that sort of, guide my actions in sort of the deepest way. Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, sure. So I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God. I was raised in a version of Judaism which was sort of theologically non-committal, but I think for a lot of people, Reform Judaism is a kind of cultural thing as much as it is religion. But in any case, I came out of that upbringing not believing in God, although I believed in God for a brief period of time when I was younger. And I don't have a lot of philosophers today are very confident in the truth of the doctrine called physicalism, the view that the physical world is all there is, that all there are physical objects and physical facts about those objects. I am not a super confident in physicalism, although I think that if there is anything beyond the physical world, or if there's anything outside of the physical world, you need extremely good evidence to believe in it. So, as far as sort of basic beliefs in the sense of beliefs about the fundamental structure of the world or the fundamental sorts of things that the world contains, I'm not a diehard or committed physicalist, but if there are going to be any counterexamples to physicalism, I'd need to see a lot of evidence. As far as my beliefs about sort of what to do, my practical beliefs, I think there are two types of philosophical belief in this kind of vicinity that I think of as sort of most fundamental. One is my moral beliefs, my beliefs about what we should do, all things considered. I'm a utilitarian. I think that the best option is the option that contributes the most happiness to the world. Utilitarianism comes in different flavors depending on how exactly you think of what happiness is. We could get into some of the details there, but suffice it to say, yeah, I'm some kind of utilitarian. But I also think that sometimes we turn to philosophy, not so much when we're looking for guidance about what to do, as when we're looking for guidance about what to feel, how to kind of emotionally orient ourselves to the world. And I think that questions about sort of when emotions fit a situation, when emotions are sort of appropriate responses to a situation, when emotions are rational or irrational, are importantly different from questions about what to do, all things considered. So here I don't have especially firm or confident beliefs about emotional rationality, but I tend to think about when an emotion fits a situation in terms of the function of the emotion, in some sense or other, what the emotion is for, where this could be shaped by evolution, but also could be shaped by culture, could be shaped by individual development. What the emotion is, in the words of one philosopher, set up to be set off by. So, a lot of the time when I sort of want to sort of take the kind of step back from the middle of the action that's often characteristic of philosophy, I end up returning to this sort of territory, to thinking about questions about emotional rationality, and I tend to think about those in terms of the functions of emotions. So, yeah, God, I mean, I've never really tried to explain my basic beliefs about the world, at least not recently. But okay. I think that's a start anyway.
Cool. Okay, so by morality, then you're gonna use utilitarian, right? Okay, but what I think about worldviews, right? We're all humans and we're all limited beings, and we try to make the best model of the universe of reality as we can, but so far it's just limited based on what we can know or what we seem to be able to know, right? And so when it comes to your epistemology, right, how do you arrive at the truth, or at least not at infallible truth, but how do you know that you're arriving at something that corresponds to reality? I guess let's say, how about your utilitarianism, right? What or your views on metaphysics, or how do you know these stuff?
Yeah, well, yeah, obviously that's a very big question. It's a hard question to answer. It's a hard question to answer because, you can, when you get, in a sense, the way to answer it is to go through everything that you know one by one and ask, how do you know that thing? How do I know what time is it? I looked at the clock, but sort of, deep down, or sort of what are my sort of most fundamental beliefs about how it's rational to form new beliefs, or how to assign, your credence to things. Mm-hmm. That's I am some kind of, this is, it gets into technical territory pretty quickly, but I'm some kind of objective Bayesian. Okay, so maybe I'll take a second I'm not an expert in epistemology, but I'll take a second to try to explain what I think that means. So a Bayesian is somebody who thinks that, at least ideally, a rational person is a person whose beliefs can be described as probabilities that you assign to different propositions. So, probabilities obey certain axioms, the axioms of probability theory. So, if you, for example, believe that it's going to rain today to degree 0.7, then you believe that it's not going to rain to degree 0.3 to 1 minus degree 0.7. So that would be one instance of one of the axioms of probability, for example. And Bayesians think that you update your beliefs in terms of, in light of new evidence, in terms of conditionalizing, as they say, on that evidence. So if your beliefs are probabilities, they define what are called conditional probabilities. So the probability of some hypothesis given that evidence. And so part of what it is to be rational is when you acquire that evidence to update your probabilities, to update your credences to the conditional probabilities on that evidence. So if the probability that it's going to rain today, when I'm getting ready to leave the house in the morning is 0.5, I'm completely agnostic as to whether it's going to rain today. And then I go outside and I look up at the sky and the clouds are very dark and so on. Maybe that upgrades my conditional probability that it's going to rain given that the clouds are dark was conditional on the evidence that the clouds are dark was something like 0.9. So now that I see that the clouds are dark, I'm going to update my probability that it's going to rain to 0.9. So that's Bayesianism. The objective part of Bayesianism is a kind of constraint on what sorts of probability distributions people can have that are rational. So some Bayesians are subjective Bayesians. They think that any probability distribution that you have over the various propositions you might believe is rational as long as it obeys the laws of probability theory. I think that the probability distributions have to obey certain further laws or certain further constrictions. Exactly what those restrictions are, I couldn't tell you, but they're going to have to do with how you update your beliefs in light of statistical information. They're going to have to do with how you update your beliefs in light of how well they explain, how well various propositions explain the facts of your experience. So, I think that a lot of our knowledge of the world comes from trying to explain the stuff that happens to us and, looking for better or worse explanations of what happens to us.
Yeah.
And so, the way that I think you fit that into a Bayesian framework is by having some sorts of explanatory restrictions on what counts as a rational probability distribution. That is an extremely technical answer for to this question, but I'm not sure if I could give another answer that I would both actually believe and that would be suitably general enough. So,
yeah, okay.
sorry about that.
No worries. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Okay. Well, when we discuss, let's say, about like having multiple beliefs, right? And you say that you measure them, the probability and all of that technical stuff. What I guess in principle, these things have to not contradict each other, right? They have to be coherent and both coherent and corresponding to reality at the very foundations, I guess. And I know, and I like to ask, a lot of people, right? Like, for example, when it comes down to morality, ethics, they all, when it comes, also atheists, right? Especially atheists, when it comes to them, morality becomes ultimately subjective. But there are atheists who believe in more an absolutes, right? And moral realism. But what is your take on it? Because utilitarianism, I guess it falls into the realm of permissive, that everything is permissible and all of that. What would you say?
Well, I don't think that utilitarianism is an especially permissive moral view. If anything, utilitarians have been accused in the past of adopting at least in theory, an implausibly demanding and implausibly restrictive moral view.
Mm-hmm.
But so there are two types of questions that you can ask about very, very roughly about morality. One is sort of first order normative questions. You can ask what's right or wrong, what's good or bad, what's brave or cowardly or friendly or kind, and so on. These are first order normative questions, practical ethical questions. And then you can ask meta-ethical questions about roughly how morality fits into the world. How do people think and talk about morality? What's the relationship between moral facts, if there are any, and biological or physical or psychological facts, and so on. I am some kind of at the meta-ethical level, I'm some kind of anti-realist. I don't think that there are objective facts of the matter about what's right or wrong or what's better or worse than anything else. Partly for psychological reasons, I take at least a lot, although not all, of our moral attitudes to be something more like desires or emotions rather than beliefs. And desires or emotions can't be true or false, unlike beliefs. So when you express anger at somebody, there's no fact of the matter about whether that anger is true, that your anger isn't truth apt. So to the extent that moral judgments are things like, they're not exactly or necessarily or always the same thing as anger, but to the extent that they're sort of kind of things like anger, there's not going to be a fact of the matter about the truth of your moral judgment. But I take those meta-ethical questions and first order normative questions to be largely unrelated to each other. There are ways of making these connections. There are ways of using meta-ethical principles or facts to motivate your first order or argue for your first order normative beliefs, moral beliefs. But these two things are, at least in principle, distinct. So it's possible for somebody to be a utilitarian and be a moral realist, somebody who thinks that there are, mind-independent facts.
No, that's very, I guess that I would call that cognitive dissonance, though, won't it, right? By definition, being utilitarian, it's just, like you're following this definition of morality, right? Maximizing happiness and whatnot, and well-being, but it's not really an absolute, right? It's just something you prefer intuitionally or subjectively. It's that's why I guess I would call that cognitive dissonance, and that's the thing I avoid, right? Like, for example, when it comes to human rights, like, or topics like that, like for example, society, it grounds itself on these basics, and especially in liberal societies. But when asked about what the ontology of these things are, then it starts to falter. It's just socially constructed. We're just doing these things because it's useful to us, right? And that's where I really start to disagree with them, right? Like, so you're acting as if someone has human rights, but it's something we just made up, but to you, it's really real, right? In the phenomena of your in the conception of what like humans are, and like what they deserve and whatnot, dignity. To me, like it has to be grounded on something more foundational than just being useful, right? Like, for example, like if I love my family, right? If my love for my family, I wouldn't argue that it's something rational, right? Like, I wouldn't say that, oh, I love my family because I want to survive, because it's part of my evolution that I live in a family institution and whatnot. No, I would say that I love my family because this love is real. It's something that is really there, right? And we don't like to say stuff like I love them because scientifically, mathematically, and whatnot, technically. So that's why I guess that these are the foundations of why I'm a Christian, right? It's because what I find that are things that are real, and if I act as if they are real, then that's where I start, right? But I guess you would do differently, I guess, because you're a philosophy professor, and I guess you have to be more technical about these things, especially when you're focused on analytic philosophy. I myself, I'm more of inclined with continental, but how about you?
Yeah, there's a lot to respond to there. Yeah, I mean, I think that the distinction between continental and analytic philosophy and the sort of sociology of how people who work in this kind of broadly European tradition and people who work in this broadly English speaking tradition have gotten along with each other or failed to get along with each other. I think that sociology has been fraught and unproductive. But yeah, I mean, most of the time when I draw on resources from other philosophers, they're coming out of that tradition. They're coming out of the analytic English speaking philosophical tradition, although not exclusively. So I was reading some continental philosophy yesterday and enjoying it. Reading the manifesto for the Situationists International, written by the continental philosopher Guy Debord. I mean, it's good stuff. It's good. Yeah. It's good philosophy. It's frustrating sometimes, but it's interesting. On the question of whether ethics needs some kind of metaphysical grounding, well, I mean, there are a couple of things to say. One thing I think, just again, this is just a logical point. It's perfectly possible to believe in human rights, to believe that, for example, people have a right to free speech, and to have different beliefs about what grounds or explains those rights. So some people think that rights are grounded in some kind of consensus, or what people would agree to, what sorts of rules people would agree to live by if we could argue reasonably and openly with one another. Other people think that rights are grounded in God. So John Locke, for example, is somebody who would believe in human rights, but gives these rights a metaphysical grounding. And you could say the same thing about, I'm not going to say any possible normative ethical view, but lots and lots of ethical, normative ethical views at the very least are at least logically, in principle, compatible with a range of meta-ethical views about what grounds those beliefs, the epistemology of those beliefs, the deep down content or moral psychology of those beliefs, and so on. I think that said, I do think that there is a kind of, there is a sort of fundamental theoretical difference, which isn't to say that it's an unbridgeable gap or that it's impossible for people to reach agreement about this stuff, but there are sort of two very different kind of theoretical tendencies in the history of philosophy, and this isn't just Western philosophy. I think you also see it in Buddhism and Hinduism and in the history of Chinese philosophy and so on, and where there are some philosophers who look for sort of stable or eternal or unchanging or morally good sort of foundations for the world, some things that sort of ground facts about the rest of the world or explain in deep down facts about the rest of the world, and other types of philosophers who don't, who either don't think that there is anything eternal or unchanging, or don't think that it's good, or don't think that the facts in other sorts of domains are grounded by facts about what's good or unchanging. And you see this, for example, in, I think, this kind of theoretical difference in the differences between Hindu and Buddhist attitudes towards the self. So the traditional Hindu thinking about the self has it that it's something that sort of, it's a deep down or somehow essential property of you. It's an eternal, unchanging, at least in some important respects, feature of you. And the at least one traditional Buddhist doctrine is that there is no such thing. There is no way you are deep down. All you are is a sort of series of sort of moments in time or space that are, or consciousness that are connected to one another. And I think you see some variation on that that kind of disagreement playing out in all sorts of domains. And I think you're pointing to a disagreement that here, you're pointing to a version of that disagreement in the moral domain. So,
yeah. I
mean, how could you resolve these disagreements? What's the sort of, basis of these disagreements, if there is any? That's above my pay grade. I don't have an answer.
Okay. But I'd like to talk about the meta stuff here before we start diving into like why you don't believe in God, or why you decided to take utilitarianism or whatever politics that political positions that you might hold, right? So why philosophy, right, bro? Like me. I love philosophy because it's part of my personality. I'm a really introspective person, and using just the tools, it allows me to explore the depths within and out of me, right? But why are you into philosophy right now? Why choose this career, and how has it been treating you?
Yeah, that's a hard question. It's like, to some extent, I want to say, why not philosophy? I think people are naturally inclined to ask, or sort of, especially as children, predisposed to ask philosophical questions, especially if they have any kind of leisure time to themselves. Any kid who has some sort of quiet time to think asks questions about, maybe it's the existence of God or the afterlife, maybe it's about what's right or wrong, maybe it's about whether there's anything that any fact of the matter when they disagree with their friends about whether some music or art is good or bad. Maybe it's facts about questions about where the world came from, or whether you see things or perceive things the same way that I see or perceive things, how we could know about what other people perceive. I mean, everybody who has the time, asks some version of these questions when they're young. And, who knows what the hell happens to them for a lot of people. Maybe people become embarrassed. Maybe people are taught to think that these questions are silly. Maybe people are taught to think that these questions are impractical or childish. I don't know. But one way of answering the question is to say whatever that thing is that happens to people where they give up on these questions, or suppress them or get distracted from them. That just never happened to me. I mean, but I think I think you can. I also say that I could also say that philosophy is just really fun. Like, I just really enjoy it. I mean, sometimes it's difficult, sometimes it's painful, sometimes it's frustrating. You hit your head against the wall and so on. But I just really, really like thinking about the philosophical questions that exercise me. I like reasoning with other people. I like talking with other people about them. And in some cases, I think that there's a I don't know if a more objective, if you like, or sort of a justification for caring about these questions or working on them. Philosophy is sort of at the root of a lot of social problems that we have, or sort of matters of public concern. I think we're living in a time when, sticking to the meta stuff for a second, but at the very least, we're living in a time when sort of accepted truisms about what a just society it looks like are starting to break down. And people are thinking in a fundamental way about how we want to live and how we want to get along with each other, how society should organize. And those questions are just live. Those questions are just in the newspapers. You can't avoid them to that extent. Or at least we have to come to some kind of agreement that's, can serve as, or at least, practically speaking, we have to come to some sort of solution to this. Questions about how our knowledge creating and knowledge sharing institutions, schools and newspapers and scientific research organizations should be structured, how they should make their decisions, what sorts of features you want these things to have. Those are philosophical questions, and I think those questions are in the newspapers every day. I run this speaker series in collaboration with the Brooklyn Public Library. Somebody gave a talk, philosopher Justin Garson gave a talk a couple of weeks ago about mental illness and what makes some characteristic of a person a mental disorder rather than.
But basically, you're into philosophy because it's relevant, right? That's basically it, I guess. Yeah.
In a nutshell, yes, it's relevant. Yeah.
Okay, but here's another question I got in mind because I hesitate to call myself a philosopher, right? I love philosophy. I want to get a PhD on philosophy someday, but for me, I guess anyone that thinks, or in any way, if you just think, you're already doing some sort of philosophy, right? But what is it? Does it mean to be a philosopher, and why do you call yourself a philosopher?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think one kind of boring or unreflective kind of answer is to say, like, well, this is what I study. Philosophy is the subject that I study and write about and teach about, and in general, if you study and write about and teach about, some subject, then you call yourself a practitioner of the subject. And so that's what I am. I'm a philosopher. I'm a practitioner of the subject of philosophy. But there's a more interesting or a deeper kind of question here, which is sort of like, what do you get out of calling somebody or considering somebody a philosopher? So for example, we're having a kind of, I don't know if you could call it an existential crisis, but you were having some kind of, turmoil within the professional philosophy, where I think a lot of people feel like they're getting bored or restless with the sort of philosophical traditions and texts that have been, considered sort of acceptable or mainstream or normal or whatever in recent years. And so people are looking to other types of thinkers and other types of writers and other types of orators from the past and asking, well, what happens if we consider this person a philosopher, or for that matter, from the present? What happens if we consider this person a philosopher? If we put this person kind of in connection with or in conversation with the other sorts of traditions of philosophy that we already recognize? What happens to, or for that matter, if you're teaching a first or second or third grade philosophy class, what happens when you consider the students philosophers? Not to say that they're, every student is, Aristotle or, Mengzi or Mosey or something like that, but just to say, what happens when you consider, when you treat somebody as a philosopher, when you sort of dignify their thoughts with respect, when you think of them as being worth sort of reading or understanding critically and in light of various philosophical traditions? Well, you can treat that person as sort of fully human in a way that you might not have been treating them as fully human in the past, and that could be valuable. Maybe sometimes if a first grader is having a temper tantrum, you don't need to treat them as a philosopher. You need to treat them as somebody who's having some sort of, episode that you need to control or, not reason with. But, at least a lot of the time, I think all sorts of people can be profitably, not people who have zero professional training whatsoever, can be treated as philosophers profitably, both for their own benefit and for the benefit of the philosophical tradition. There's a great book by the philosopher Henry Odera Aruka called Sage Philosophy, where he goes to a bunch of villages around, I believe it's Kenya, but honestly, I can't remember which African country off the top of my head, honestly. But he goes to a bunch of villages and says, bring me somebody wise, bring me somebody who's regarded as wise as a sage in the village. And they talk about philosophy. These people are often illiterate or have zero formal education, but they can hang. They can have a useful, productive conversation. Anyway, so
Okay.
I think the question, when you ask yourself, if you feel a little bit iffy about calling yourself a philosopher, maybe ask yourself, what does it do to you to call yourself a philosopher? What does it do for you to present yourself to other people as a philosopher? And you might take it from there.
Okay, cool. Okay, but I guess when it comes to philosophy, even scientists could be called philosophers, because they practice the philosophy of science, right? Artists can be called philosophers because they practice the philosophy of art, Politicians, I get it, because philosophy is like the mother of all branches of knowledge, I think. And but okay, let's get down to business now, I guess. I guess the basics of your beliefs earlier, you mentioned that it's God exclusive. Okay, let's encounter this idea a bit, right? And confront it. So, is there a possibility that God could exist, or not? Because you're an atheist, so I would say, do you positively say that God doesn't exist, or that or any God doesn't exist, or just the Christian or a religious one?
You know, is it possible that God exists? Yeah, well, all sorts of things are possible. I'm very confident that God doesn't exist. You know, yeah.
But why? Why? I guess like
Why? Yeah. Well, for starters, the problem of evil. So, you know, if we think of God the way that people have thought of God in the past, and many people think of God today, as somebody who wants the best for the world and can do whatever they want, is sort of capable of doing anything, knows how to do anything, knows how to bring about any possible outcome, well, then the world would be perfect if there were such a being. They would want the best. They would know how to bring it about, and they could bring it about. So they would bring it about. But of course, the world isn't perfect. So you know, no such being exists. You know, there are a couple of different ways of responding to this sort of argument. You know, one is to offer, you know, a theodicy, to explain why the world is in fact perfect. I don't think that that's going to yield any fruit. Another possibility is to say, oh, that, you know, God exists, but God either you know, doesn't want the best for the world, or isn't capable of bringing it about, or doesn't know how to bring it about. I think, you know, you get into quickly, I think, sort of semantic or definitional territory here. You know, some people are willing to call all sorts of natural phenomena God. You know, the sum total of the universe as a whole, or, you know, whatever you know, guides our sort of best or most noble impulses, something like that. Well, you know, sure, we can believe in that, but, you know, does it really make sense to call that God? You know, I mean, one way of thinking about these sorts of, or getting around these sorts of semantic or definitional or terminological questions is to ask practical questions. So, you know, what is it that people want out of the existence of God? What is it that people how does the existence of God sort of play a role in people's practical reasoning, their reasoning about what to do? And different people, of course, use their belief in God to motivate different sorts of actions, but some kind of attitude of or activity of worship seems to be common to, if not all, then at least a lot of them. So, you know, why do people, what does the existence of God do for people practically? Well, God is, you know, something that, according to them, it makes sense to worship. And so then we can ask ourselves, well, does it make sense to worship anything? And again, I think the answer is no. So what does it mean to worship something? What do you have to do to yourself to worship something? You have to think that something is so much better than you, that you sort of completely submit yourself to its will and its judgment. But I don't think that we should think that anything is so much better than us that we completely submit ourselves to its will and its judgment. For one thing, there's something kind of undignified about that. There's something that sort of seems like it's a failure to take yourself seriously in that sort of attitude towards another creature. We would certainly think that there's something, or at least many of us would think that there's something, you know, sad or pitiful about somebody who worshipped another human being in this way. Something slave-like about that. But furthermore, even if there were such a creature whose sort of judgment and will were somehow infinitely better than yours, or better enough at least to justify this attitude of worship, you shouldn't trust you shouldn't trust yourself to identify such a creature. You could be wrong, and if you were wrong, well, then you're making a big mistake by worshiping it. So those are a couple of reasons. Oh, sorry, I gotta it's gone. Okay. So I don't think it makes sense to worship anybody or anything for those reasons, and so I don't think it makes sense to believe in God.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I guess then that when it comes to the arguments that that others present, right, that theists presents, you also have counter arguments for them, I guess. Like, for example, the contingency argument, which is one of the strongest, which is the ontological, cosmological, even the teleological ones. How do you interact with those arguments, or do you just ignore them because of your position that you think is already strong enough to prove that God doesn't exist?
Yeah, I have responses to at least some of these arguments. The ontological argument can take different forms, but on at least one form, it's logically invalid. So, an invalid argument, doesn't give any reason or any conclusive reason, at least, to believe its conclusion. So, we could go into what makes the ontological argument invalid if you like, but we don't have to. Yeah. The teleological argument, I take it to be an inference to the best explanation from complexity in the biological world to a designer, but inferences to the best explanation only work when there is no better explanation of the evidence of design, but there is a better explanation of the evidence of design, which comes from the theory of evolution. The cosmological argument just ignores a number of possible causal histories that the world could have. So, on the one hand, there could be multiple uncaused causes, in which case it would be hard to identify God as the one uncaused cause. There could be a single uncaused cause, but it might just not be God. So, Thomas Aquinas, for example, thought that, reason shows that there's an uncaused cause, that there's a prime mover, but revelation, the Bible shows that that's God. So we could question that second step, even if we acknowledge the first step or agreed with the first. You could think that there are infinitely many events in the past, but there is a time before which there were no events. So there are ways of modeling that possibility mathematically, which this possibility was, at least historically, for mathematically good reasons, but at least historically it was, ignored by proponents of the cosmological argument. You could argue some things might cause themselves to exist within the physical world. The world might have caused itself to exist, and so on. So the cosmological argument, I don't think furnishes any kind of conclusive support for its for the existence of God, because I think there are a bunch of different causal histories that the world could have had other than God made it. So I'm not an expert on this stuff. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff because I've
Yeah. Okay.
I argue to my own satisfaction that God doesn't
by
exist.
the way, I'd like to congratulate you on the success of your book. I would really love to read it someday. Yeah, and But
Thank you.
okay, but when it comes to right, like you're a philosopher and you're a practitioner of it too, right? Like, what direction in your career do you think you're heading, or are you just
Mm,
going with the flow, or is there a dream goal or whatnot?
yeah, God. I mean, a lot of the time, not all the time, but a lot of the time, what gets me most excited in philosophy, the sorts of projects that I'm most excited to pursue, are both are I guess two types of things. One is just like I think interesting or novel types of public philosophy, like ways of doing sort of public outreach or engaging with with people outside of universities that just sort of haven't been tried yet or are new to me or something like that. And another type of philosophy, I mean, my research with the capital R, that I like pursuing is sort of stuff that nobody has done yet. Just putting together different literatures, different sources of knowledge, different ideas, in novel ways, asking questions that nobody's ever asked before. I think a lot of philosophers, and there's nothing wrong with this, but a lot of philosophers like sort of contributing or sort of diving into debates that are already well underway. I'm more interested in my original work. I think there's more like value to add, at least for me, given my skills and interests in exploring things that people haven't explored in the past. So, like for example, I think that there are philosophically interesting things that you can learn from looking very closely at transcripts of conversations and asking what sorts of how people communicate about morality in those conversations.
Mm-hmm.
So doing sort of very detailed empirical but qualitative descriptions of moral conversations.
Mm-hmm.
I think you can learn. That's something that I have explored.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm really interested in the question of what makes a story newsworthy.
Mm-hmm.
What makes a story sort of significant in a way that would, at least on the face of it, or other things being equal, justify devoting sort of journalistic resources to it. I'm really interested these days. I'm writing a paper about philosophical spaces, about where people do philosophy and how we can design the spaces where people do philosophy, and what are the sorts of challenges and opportunities that are presented by the task of designing these spaces. I don't, at least as far as I know, nobody's asked that question, at least not in exactly that form, ever. So at least as far as I know. And so that's I think, if I think of a direction for my career, I have various books I'd like to write, papers I'd like to write,
Mm-hmm.
but I think from 60,000 feet in the air, that's kind of the two things that I think sort of most motivate me, that get me most excited
Mm-hmm.
to get up in the morning and do my thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, one last question, right? But so philosophy it has been, like, I guess, lost its era in this 21st century because of the scientism and the growing, like, trend of Stephen Hawking saying that philosophy is dead and whatnot. But I disagree, right? Like, philosophy still has its place in this world, right? Like, but when it comes to what its position is in the public arena, right? Like, people like Noah Chomsky, like William Lane Craig, Sam Harris, these a lot of other philosophers, of course, that I'd like to mention too. But I guess it's more of just something that they're philosophy is just like have become like a hobby or whatnot, or just I guess it's not really playing its role, or I guess but I think it's still essential because philosophy mainly conceives of ideas, right? And these ideas can actually determine the direction that society takes, right? It's especially when you look at the ideas surrounding the time of like World War II, right? Like fascism and the evolutionism, Darwinism, and then there's liberalism, and then so many ideas actually are the ones that shape society and civilization, right? And I think that today, philosophy has the role to bring us to clarification of the social issues that we have today, too, right? Like, for example, China. It is a global economic power, but also what comes with it are the ideas and the values that they have, and they will attempt to bring it to the world too, right? And what is and what kind of ideas, and because the only battle we can do there that should take place is in the thinking minds of every citizen, right? And I guess that's where philosophy fights, right? In the minds of the normal, average working people, because it's not just in the academia. It's not supposed to be just in the really intellectual people. Philosophy is for the average person, and with also including mental health. Generally life, love, family, work, career. So what do you think is the place of philosophy in the 21st century?
Yeah, I think there are a bunch of different places for a bunch of types of philosophy.
Yeah.
So I think some philosophy, for example, might be useful for people who have a lot of sort of personal anxiety or frustration surrounding philosophical questions. People are emotionally invested in and can, in philosophical questions, and can have a lot of turmoil in their lives sort of result from, having gone down a certain philosophical rabbit hole, or, having, reached a certain sort of conclusion or backed themselves into a corner theoretically. And I think philosophers can help people in that way. I think there's work for philosophers to do in, as you say, clarifying the sort of basic disagreements between and advantages and disadvantages of various ways of organizing a society. Basic questions of political economy or the best form of government and so on. I think there is room for philosophers in legal settings, for example, on legal interpretation, or in arguing for basic human rights, or clarifying what those rights amount to, and so on. I think there's also room for philosophers in sort of collaboration with scientists in sort of a more purely academic, context. So, philosophers have contributed all sorts of ideas to linguistics and psychology, and to some extent, even in an ongoing way, to some extent, physics and biology, and they're and I think there's sort of continuing work for philosophers to do in that regard. I think there's also a lot of growth or progress in philosophy comes from trying to turn, questions that previously people had, answered from the armchair, without just sort of through, reflecting, sort of pure reasoning, trying to turn those into empirical questions, trying to turn them into questions that could, become scientific. And That's a thing that philosophers do themselves. And it's also a thing that philosophers do sort of in collaboration with, or at least taking inspiration from the empirical methodologies that, that scientists have to offer. So yeah, I think there's a lot of room for philosophers to continue to contribute to the world. And I'll say I share your disappointment, I guess, that philosophers are sometimes sort of not included in conversations that they could usefully be included in, or philosophers are sort of not present in the public eye or in public discourse in a way that the world would benefit from. But I do think that I do think that this is something that can change, and I do think that it's something that you can see from one culture to another. There are differences here. There are differences from one country to the next. For example, in how present philosophers are in public discourse. There's Germany and France and Italy. There are philosophers on TV all the time. You might think maybe they're not the right kind of philosophers or something like that, but they're there. Whatever you think of Lenin or Mao, those were philosophically sophisticated thinkers, and their philosophical thinking was sort of, played an important role in the development of the Soviet Union and communist China. You could say the same thing about Julius Nyerere in Tanzania. There's room for, with the right sorts of cultural change or the right sorts of outreach or the right sorts of political organization, the state of affairs that you lament could change. So let's keep our fingers crossed that it does sometime in our lives.
Yeah, and bro, it's been an awesome conversation. I wish that we could make it longer, like 2 hours, but I keep it like 1 hour. But I really hope that we could have another episode someday and talk about a really specific topic. But right now, I just want to get the gist of what you believe, your positions, and I really find them awesome, and they're really convincing, I guess. And
right on. Thank you so much. Yeah, this was a blast, dude. Happy to do some other version of this anytime you want.
Awesome. Bye, bro. Thank you so much.
All right, later, man.
So that's the end of it. Thanks for tuning in, guys. This is your host, Elmo Ador Jr. And thank you for listening in. And please subscribe. Please follow us on Facebook. Please follow this. Please. Thanks.
It's the holidays, which usually means employing your surprise face. But winter-winning scratchers are loaded with $500 prizes, so there's always a surprise. Unlike the 27th snowflake ornament from Grandma. Play along with holiday scratchers from the Virginia Lottery at a retailer near you. For odds and more information, visit VALottery.com.
It used to be hard to find the exact auto parts you needed, and that meant spending a lot of time at swap meets. It's a different game now when you can order exactly what you need from eBay Motors. They have 122 million parts, so you can always find the right fitment. Spend less time searching and more time building with the eBay Motors app, or visit ebaymotors.com. Let's ride.